am delighted to share with you a glimpse into a deeply personal journey that began in the quiet corners of an old library during my student days. It was there that I took my first steps toward understanding how we can find more happiness and peace of mind amidst the swirl of life's challenges. I hope you enjoy it.
Sophia's footsteps echoed softly in the beautiful old library, a place she once considered a sanctuary. The marble floor and large ornate windows of the entrance were reminders of happier times, when as a young girl she would love coming into the library to find her next adventure. Now it felt like stepping into a forgotten world. Her light-hearted happiness buried somewhere under the busyness of college assignments and relentless tennis training that now seemed to fill her days. Life seemed like a never-ending cycle of tasks and disappointments. Her recent loss in a tennis tournament added weight to her already heavy heart, dragging her spirits even lower. Driven by a longing to escape this feeling, Sophia had wandered for nearly an hour before she found herself somewhere strangely familiar. She was in front of the grand stone exterior of the old town library. Almost instinctively, she had pushed open the heavy wooden doors and stepped into a haven she hadn't set foot in for what seemed like a lifetime. The library, with its towering shelves and aroma of old books, offered an immediate sense of calm and even a touch of nostalgia for Sophia. It was as if the whole building was an old friend, welcoming her back. As she wandered aimlessly between the rows of books taking in the quiet atmosphere, her gaze landed on Mrs. Evelyn, the librarian, known not just for her knowledge of books, but for her uncanny ability to read the hearts of those who sought inspiration and sanctuary within the library walls. As Sophia walked a little closer, the heaviness that burdened her heart seemed to lighten, drawn to the warmth emanating from Mrs. Evelyn's presence. Mrs. Evelyn smiled, a warm, genuine smile as her eyes met with Sophia's.
"Hello, dear, how can I help? Perhaps you would like to sit down?"
Mrs. Evelyn invited. Sophia felt there was something special about this meeting, as if it was fate or even as if they had met before. It was as if Mrs. Evelyn had known Sophia all her life, understanding her struggles without a word being spoken. Taking a seat beside her, Sophia felt completely safe and at ease. She couldn't remember the last time she felt like this. After just a few minutes, Sophia found herself pouring out her heart to the wise librarian. She spoke of the endless hours spent poring over textbooks, the exhaustion she often felt, and the tennis matches that once brought joy, but now only added to the weight she carried. As she spoke about her fears and her anxieties, each word, each sentence was like a small part of her burden being lifted. Mrs. Evelyn listened, her eyes reflecting a depth of understanding and compassion that reached straight to Sophia's heart. There were no interruptions, no quick fixes offered. Just a space held for Sophia's truths to be acknowledged and accepted. This simple act of listening, of truly hearing Sophia, was a balm to her weary soul, a first step on the path to finding the peace she sought. When Sophia stopped talking, she let out a small sigh and looked up at Mrs. Evelyn, her eyes almost apologizing for all that she had said. Mrs. Evelyn smiled a comforting smile to let Sophia know that it was all right, and then began to speak.
"You know, my dear, life is very much like this library. Among these shelves lie countless stories, each evoking different feelings and thoughts. Yet it is you who decides which book to open, which story to immerse yourself in."
Sophia listened, intrigued by the unexpected analogy. Mrs. Evelyn continued, explaining the power of the mind and the significance of where one places their attention.
"Just as you choose a book to read, you can choose the thoughts you entertain. Focusing on your worries and disappointments, you're inadvertently reading the same disheartening story over and over. But, dear Sophia, there are so many other books to explore, other stories that can uplift you and fill your days with joy."
Sophia felt a flicker of hope, with the idea that she might have control over her feelings and could change the feeling of her days. Eager to understand more, Sophia shared her specific worries about tennis and her studies, and how her anxiety seemed to be a constant companion. Mrs. Evelyn, her eyes seemingly filled with empathy and wisdom, paused before replying, making sure Sophia had finished.
"You're not alone in feeling this way, my dear. The mind is powerful and can stir up all kinds of emotions that can easily darken our days if we are not careful. But thankfully, It can also be taught to be a sanctuary of peace rather than a source of turmoil.
Mrs. Evelyn reassured her. As the two sat together and talked, both felt the perfection of their meeting, and the time passed easily.
Oh, it has been lovely to talk to you, Sophia. Unfortunately, the library is about to close for the weekend, but if you do want to hear a little more, please feel free to stop by again for another little chat,
Mrs. Evelyn offered. As soon as the words left her lips, Mrs. Evelyn noticed the disappointment wash over Sophia's face, and that flicker of new-found hope was gone just as quickly as it had arrived. Mrs. Evelyn couldn't leave this young woman without at least a little more of the understanding, comfort and wisdom that she knew she had to give.
Come to think of it,
Mrs. Evelyn added quickly,
you could come to my cottage for a cup of tea and another chat tomorrow if you'd like.
Sophia suddenly sat up and looked at Mrs. Evelyn with eyes wide with hope once again.
Oh, yes, that would be lovely. Thank you, Mrs. Evelyn,
Sophia said without a second thought. The invitation for tea the following afternoon promised not just the comfort of Mrs. Evelyn's company and her lovely cottage, but the possibility of discovering a way to feel better about her life. Sophia left the library that day with a sense of anticipation she hadn't felt in a long time. The heavy doors of the library seemed lighter as she pushed them open to leave, a symbolic gesture that maybe the weight she carried could be lightened too. As Sophia lay in bed that night, the idea that she could choose her thoughts, much like choosing a book to read, lingered in her mind. It was a simple concept, yet it felt revolutionary. The realization that she had been replaying the same negative story in her mind made her eager to learn how she could write a new story for herself, one filled with peace, joy, and contentment. The thought of tea with Mrs. Evelyn the next day felt so good. It was hopefully a step towards understanding how to take more control of her mind and how she could feel better again. She thought about Mrs. Evelyn and how she looked so much at peace and seemed so wise. Sophia wanted to learn how she could be like that, and she imagined what it would be like to be happy and free from stress. She fell asleep with a sense of calm she hadn't felt in as long as she could remember, as hope and the first whispers of peace sent her to sleep.
I hope you found a little inspiration in this snippet of my journey, and I look forward to sharing a little more with you soon.